comprehensive services that meet young people's needs while encouraging them to access their services and how they may feel most comfortable. Thank you.
I don't think there's any audio on the I don't think there's any audio on the video.
Yeah, Keela, it's not playing the audio. I think there might be a lag.
Oh, you guys can't hear the audio? Oh. Okay, give me 1 second.
My knowledgeable audience, for what it's worth.
Could you hear that?
Please, Subhanallah, alhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ali Sayyidina Muhammad kama sibta Ibrahim wa ali Ibrahim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ali Sayyidina Muhammad wa barik ala Ibrahim wa Ibrahim innaka hamidun majid. Rabbi ashrah fi sadri yassir li amri uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli amin. Hello, Bismillah, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Huxtable Mohr, and I am very happy to be here today to present the Muslim Mental Health Conference. Thank you so much to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to speak, and really want to share what I have with my knowledgeable audience for what it's worth. Please take it for reflection, and really appreciate you watching my talk. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen with you and launch right into it. So my talk today is called Am I Me and Who's She? Liberation Psychology, Historical Memory in Muslim Women. It's based on an article that I published in fall of 2020 in the Islamophobia Studies Journal at the Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley. It's on a topic which is of great interest to me, liberation psychology, something that I've been writing on for a couple of years now, and I've been studying for almost 30 years now. The main goal of this presentation is to present key concepts from the article, including definitions of Islamophobia and liberation psychology, a description of mental health as a fundamental problem of human relations, comments on societal justice, historical amnesia, and mental illness, and how this relates to mental health as a fundamental societal problem. Recovering historical memory is one of the 3 urgent tasks of liberation psychology. What does it mean and why is it important? A discussion of liberation psychology, historical memory in the Muslim woman is other, including a case study of historical amnesia in the other in the Muslim woman. I'll follow this by a few conclusions. I hope you enjoy my talk. So when I began to approach this paper, I was struck by the intersections between Islamophobia and liberation psychology. If we define Islamophobia as the fear and hatred of Muslims and Islam based on the construction of a normative subject of Western European origin, which is a workable definition. There's a lot of definitions of Islamophobia, but that's one working definition. It dovetails really closely with liberation psychology, which is an explicitly decolonial framework for psychology, which again critiques this normative subject of Western European psychological approaches. And liberation psychology as a decolonial framework has many focuses. Drawing on the work of multiple people, you can come up with definitely multiple ideas from liberation psychology. But one of the things that is common is there are certain common threads: scientism, ahistoricism, individualism, positivism. Ahistoricism, the way that the European psychological approaches have talked about the self as a natural, eternal, and unchanging identity, which does not vary from culture to culture, and the emphasis on the individual as the ultimate location of psychology, and the concept of possessive individualism, which is so central to Western European thought generally. Liberation psychology tends to emphasize relationality and the relationship between the self and others, and the relationship between the self and history, and the historically constructed self and the contingent self. And in this work of rethinking the self and the ontology of the self, liberation psychology makes social justice the ultimate telos of psychology. Now, if we talk about Islamophobia, we talk about Islamophobia as a social justice issue and the critique of the Western European normative subject, then obviously there's a lot of intersections between Islamophobia and liberation psychology that are worth investigating. So to back up a little bit, if mental health is considered from a liberation psychology perspective, why is Islamophobia relevant? And Islamophobia is a social problem. It's not necessarily a mental health problem. But Islamophobia connects really closely to individual health problems, but it's also, in a liberation psychology lens, a societal mental illness. If you think about the way we construct mental illness as an intellectual concept, a lot of people think first life, then quality of life. That's kind of the traditional European concept. First life, and then once you've established that, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then eventually you get to the ideas of quality of life. With liberation psychology, mental health is a fundamental problem of human society. I'll read you a quote from Ignacio Martin Barrow, who is considered by many the father of liberation psychology, who is a Jesuit priest who worked in El Salvador during the El Salvadorian Civil War in the 70s and 80s. He was tragically assassinated in 1989 by a U.S. trained death squad. But his work was translated into English and has been highly influential in the work of liberation psychology internationally at this point. So Martin Barrow says, if the uniqueness of human beings consists less in their being endowed with life, that is in their organic existence, and more in the kind of life they construct historically, then mental health ceases to be a secondary problem and becomes a fundamental one. It is not a matter of the individual's satisfactory functioning. Rather, it is a matter of the basic character of human relations, for that is what defines the possibilities for humanization that open up to the members of each society and group. To put it more plainly, mental health is a dimension of the relations between persons and groups more than an individual state, even though this dimension may take root differently in the body of the individuals involved in these relations. So if you look at this definition, there's kind of two components to mental health. First of all, they're both primary parts of society. And one is the societal relationships that we construct historically. That's a component of mental health. If human beings are defined societally and relationally, and our life is our life, historical life, then mental health is a fundamental piece of that, our relationships to one another. And that life that we construct historically produces individual consequences. So we know very well that Islamophobia has caused huge increases in mental health problems. And the well-documented rise in mental health problems in the Muslim community as a result of Islamophobia is basically beyond question at this point. But what about this societal dimension? How does that get deconstructed? So in terms of the societal dimensions of Islamophobia and mental health, one of the fundamental questions is societal injustice. And one of the things that liberation psychologists point to as a critical piece of societal injustice is the historical amnesia, which is created by this natural, ahistorical, eternal Western European normative subject. So the historical memory that has been erased as a result of this Western European subject in psychology, in politics, is postulated as a major cause of mental illness. And if you think of Ignacio Martin-Barro's work, again, he names 3 urgent tasks of liberation psychology: recovering historical memory, de-idealizing reality, and utilizing the virtue of the people. This is in his book, Writings on Liberation Psychology. And in this paper, we're going to focus on this first one, recovering historical memory. And historical amnesia is the reason that we need to recover historical memory. In my paper that I'm reporting back on here, I say, the loss of historical memory in the United States is enacted through the ongoing portrayal of Muslims as misogynistic terrorists who are hostile to democracy and civilization. Through the ongoing erasure of the history of Muslim civilization, particularly the history of colonialism, and the modern history of the wars of empire in the Middle East, Muslims are faced on a daily basis with the bizarre situation that we are constantly denounced by a violent, destructive military empire that is killing and destroying us as the perpetrators of violence and not the victims. This brutalization of reality, combined with the concrete attacks on Muslims, makes the psychic wounds immeasurably deeper for Muslims and non-Muslims alike. In other words, the fact that something like terrorism has been portrayed as a problem of violence among Muslims makes the war on terror, which is actually hugely violent against the Muslim community, more injurious to Muslims, because while we are being attacked, we are being portrayed as the attackers. So this disconnect between reality and the kind of narrative in society is really extreme, and it's causing an increase in mental health problems, according to a liberation psychology lens. So recovering historical memory as a task of liberation psychology involves questioning the natural and ahistorical order that normalizes oppression. These are Martin-Barro's points. Questioning the natural and ahistorical order that normalizes oppression means questioning, is the Western European subject, this civilized, peaceful, democratic subject, in the face of this barbaric Muslim other? Obviously, we as Muslims think that that's completely inaccurate, but it's widely portrayed in the media. And questioning that that order between the European kind of Eurocentric view of the world is a task of psychology, because it has to do with who we are as people, who we are as a society, and who we are as individuals. And recovering aspects of identity that are erased by this kind of naturalization of oppression serves the goal of liberation. And in a sense, this is one of the frontiers of psychological work, conscientization, a word from Paulo Freire, who many I'm sure you know as a major decolonial thinker, that the role of psychology and of action in life, liberatory action, is this dialogue between people, this dialectical engagement of reality where we decode reality and we look for the true narrative, we look for the themes that arise from the true narrative that's actually going on in society, and question the organization of society that naturalizes oppression. So that's a psychological work according to liberation psychology. In terms of this paper, I focused on one specific piece of this othering of Muslims, which was focused on Muslim women. So the case of the historical record on Muslim women, like the story of terrorism, is bizarrely reversed, and it involves a huge amount of historical amnesia. So historical depictions of Muslim society as misogynistic, in a way that was different from Europe, were pervasive throughout colonialism and even today. The depiction of the misogynistic Muslim, the gynophobic, homophobic Muslim society, in a way that portrays Muslim women as not having rights, not having a voice, not having a place in society, not being educated, not having any place in society, that ignored that historically in Europe, women didn't have the right to vote, women didn't have the right to own property, women didn't have the right to get an education, women didn't have any of these rights. So there was this portrayal of Muslim women as uneducated and oppressed that totally ignored the reality of women in Europe. This Muslim oppression of women was used as a justification for colonialism. And a lot of Muslims internalized these European projections. A classic example is Qasim Amin, who is a highly influential Egyptian Muslim who wrote the book Liberation of Women. And he talked about how Europeans were superior because of their treatment of women, and that the Muslim world needed the European influence. He was a European educated Muslim. Europeans needed to help the Muslim world because the Muslim treatment of women was so bad. Now, interestingly, this is based on a historical lie, which is that something that a lot of Europeans believe, which is that patriarchy flowed from the Middle East out into the world. There's a centering of patriarchy in the Middle East. Patriarchy being the hierarchical domination of men over women, the ownership of women by men, the subordination of women under men, and the dehumanization of women under men. And subsequently, dualism, the oppression of nature, and the racialized other, this whole self and other that has to do with hierarchy and dominance, and the naturalization of conflict as a result. This paradigm is actually originally Indo-European. If you look at the origins of patriarchy, it originated, according to the Kurgan hypothesis put forth by Maria Ngabuchis, a cultural anthropologist, well supported by historical documentation. The patriarchy originated in the Volgan steppes, northern central Europe, and flowed down into the rest of the world. Patriarchy flowed from Europe into the rest of the world, not the other way. This reality is shown in India. You look at India. There was a small, darker civilization in the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro civilization river valleys. Small, darker Dravidian civilization. Their culture is represented by the Upanishads. These Indo-Europeans, the same ones who went into Europe, went into India, destroyed this smaller, darker, more peaceful civilization, and instituted their culture, which was more warlike, represented by the Vedic culture. Again, in Europe, old Europe, matrilineal, peaceful, balanced society, destroyed by the Indo-European invasion of a culture that was predominantly patrilineal and very, very warlike. So this progression of patriarchy from Europe into the rest of the world is really significant because it has been erased in history. And if you think about the way reality works, if you know the truth, things look very different. So I'll share an example with you from my own life. I was Christian for a long time, and I was always confused by the fact that Jesus was the Son of God. I struggled with it, I grappled with it, and never understood it. When I came to Islam and I understood that Jesus was a prophet, according to this whole community that I'd become a part of, and that Jesus was not God, that there was no Trinity, that there was one creator, the amount of psychic energy that freed up for me to solve other ethical and moral problems was huge. Again, another example, the blind man with the elephant. You've got one guy on the tail thinking it's a snake. You've got one guy on the leg thinking it's a tree. You've got one guy on the trunk thinking it's a snake. You have these three blind men arguing about the nature of the elephant. Well, if you could get them together and explain to them, look, people, it's actually an elephant. You're looking at it from your limited perspective. You could expose to them the fact that it's an elephant. They would have possibilities, endless possibilities that would open up for understanding. Their arguments would be over. Endless possibilities would open up for understanding. There's a classic example of the blind man with the elephant. And that's the nature of recovering historical memory. We have the ability to see clearly what these lies are doing to us. A case study of this reveals some interesting and hugely disturbing manifestations in our culture. You ask white people and European people and the dominant culture in the United States, why are you obsessed with honor killing? Honor killing is something that people are are bringing up, you see one Muslim man kill a woman, drink tea next to her body, and it's blasted all over the world. I'm not saying that's not horrific, it is. But 3 women a day are killed by domestic violence in the United States. Their names are never mentioned. They're never in the news. 3 women a day. Over 1,000 women a year killed by domestic violence. No mention of it in the news. In fact, the Violence Against Women Act is sitting in Congress unpassed and unaddressed. It shows a disconnect that is confirmation bias, that Muslims are these violent, misogynistic people. Again, the Women's March, the expectation that when the Women's March board was restructured, that the women who founded the march, the women of color who founded the march, their politics were criticized as being less enlightened than the people who were taking over. And the idea that they're sexist and politically backwards, politically oppressive, when they founded this march, they came up with this march. Zahra Billoo, founder of CARE, was the executive director of CARE, was kicked off the board for her views on Zionism, and other people criticized. Tamika Mallory criticized for her views on the Nation of Islam. The idea that these women are open to these kinds of criticisms is a very clear example of how the Western normative subject tends to regard the world as an object where their own superiority is unquestioned, their own possibilities are unlimited and unquestioned, and the other is continually under critique and under scrutiny. And I think we as Muslims, my belief is we as Muslims internalize this. If you look at the Muslim women's blog, Muslim Girl, it's the biggest blog for Muslim women in the world. And it has a lot of posts on LGBTQ on the blog. And they're some of the most liked, shared, and followed posts on the blog. If this is the case, our biggest post, our biggest blog in the world for Muslim women is pro-LGBTQ, supportive, allyship, then why are we constantly as Muslims in this defensive posture, defending ourselves against this trope of the homophobic Muslim boogeyman? We're constantly defending ourselves against this trope. The Muslim community is constantly on the defensive about homophobia. We're being harassed continually about homophobia, but we're not homophobic in a way that's unique in the society. And it's connected again to this idea that patriarchy and misogyny are uniquely Muslim, they're uniquely Middle Eastern, but that is basically fundamentally a lie. Patriarchy and misogyny are fundamentally European. So, Liberation Psychology Society and the Recovery of Historical Memory. If you look at the way this constant dialogue continues to happen, you look at this dynamic of the Western European subject, and one of the core fundamental pieces of the Western European subject is this concept of the other, othering, and the racialized other as dehumanized, and the inevitable conflict between the Western European subject and this racialized other, and it's this paradigm of conflict, I would argue, is fundamentally patriarchy. Is one of the basic mental illnesses that psychology ought to seek to resolve. If this mental illness of patriarchy is a primary problem in society that supports oppression, then Islamophobia is just one example of many paradigms of conflict: racism, sexism, classism, environmental destruction. This idea that men dominated women, controlled, oppressed, and enrolled women is an essentially European concept as shown by her historical record. And I would like to argue, and I do argue in this article, that uncovering the Indo-European roots of the paradigm of inevitable conflict that's so specific to patriarchy presents a cure for this hallucinated reality of the Muslim other. So how is this psychology? If the fundamental illness of society is the unquestioned centrality of conflict within the structure of human relationships, which again I'm saying is the patriarchal paradigm, then the solution is re-education. The solution is decoding reality towards cooperation, harmony, and coexistence. This idea of balance and cooperation and harmony are fundamentally Islamic. if you look at the idea of an Islamic society, and while you have a lot of definitions of Islam, you could talk about Islam is maintaining the status quo, and Islam is, supporting power structures that are hierarchical and dominating, but fundamentally, if you look at Islam, it's based on a paradigm of harmony and balance. And that's true of indigenous societies, based on a concept of balance and harmony and cooperation, coexistence. Then psychology has a role in engaging people and society in this dialogue about how to create a balanced society. And this raising of consciousness is an important central higher level concept of how psychology can do the work for justice. And one of the things that I'd like to really close with is a core belief for me, which is shared by a lot of feminist, critical feminist psychology, critical race psychology, all of these kind of critical theories, that there's not a neutral stance. There's not a possibility to be neutral in this world. I'd like to argue that our role as psychologists is to take a non-neutral stance towards revitalizing human relationships by raising consciousness, by bringing to light these fundamental truths and these fundamental realities. The idea that we as psychologists have the ability to direct our work. Where are we going with our work? Are we working for justice? And how do we work for justice? And one of the key things is to uncover truth, and to talk about history, and to talk about reality, and to talk about justice, and to talk about these issues of how to create a balanced and harmonious society where we believe in coexistence, and we believe we're not able to harm someone else without harming ourselves. These ideas of relationality and the multiplicity of realities that exist on the planet, the variety of epistemologies, the widespread diversity of ways of being in the world, that until we cultivate these understandings, this is a central work of decolonial psychology and of liberation psychology. At the heart of liberation movements is the goal of human freedom. If you talk about liberation as a paradigm, freedom is essentially one of the things that it's working towards. Freedom from oppression, freedom from suffering. This freedom will only be achieved when we have recovered the truth of history, of each other and ourselves. From a liberation psychology perspective, the role of psychology is to facilitate this dialectical engagement. I'd like to close with a quote from Bell Hooks on the idea of what it means to work towards liberation. Women's liberationists, white and black, will always be at odds with one another as long as our idea of liberation is based on having the power white men have. Women's liberationists, white and black, will always be at odds with one another as long as our idea of liberation is based on having the power white men have. For that power denies unity, denies common connections, and is inherently divisive. I think in this conference, in our work as psychologists, in our work as Muslims, in our work as moving parts of the Muslim community, people in the Muslim community, that we have to think in terms of power, sharing power, thinking about power, and thinking about truth in ways that emphasize unity, create common connections, and bring us together. So that's all, folks. Thanks to the Institute for Muslim Mental Health, especially Dr. Hamada Hamid, Dr. Farhar Bassi, and Mary Ferdowsi, for their tireless work on this conference. I really appreciate being invited to speak. It's an honor, as always, and I'm incredibly grateful to be included in the work of this conference and be able to attend and participate. Thanks to Dr. Hacham Bazim of the Islamophobia Studies Center for his support and publication of my work and his leadership on the critical issue of our time, Islamophobia. And thanks to Dr. Munir Jiwa for his support of my scholarship, as well as the Center for Islamic Studies of the Graduate Theological Union for their role in furthering the work on decolonial approaches.
Okay, thank you so much for that presentation. I just want to let everyone know, if you have any questions, please do drop them in the chat box below. Inshallah, we will get to them near the end. Next up, we have presenter Jaylan Elrahman. She is currently pursuing a PhD in counseling psychology at Northeastern University. Ms. Elrahman seeks to explore the interplay between liberation psychology, decolonialization, and theoretical practice. She received her Master's of Education in Human Development and Psychology from Harvard University. She was a program manager for the Safe Spaces Project at Girl Forward, a national organization that develops and administers educational programming and community support initiatives for refugee and immigrant high school women. She is currently working towards her PhD in counseling psychology from Northeastern.
Thank you so much. Peace be upon all those who are joining or may listen whenever they may listen, wherever they may listen from. Sarah, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. I couldn't have thought of a better sort of presentation to precede my own. Such beautiful words that I think have so many parallels. So I hope we can have a really generative conversation and dialogue between the two presentations. So I was under the impression that I only had 15 minutes to present, but I do love to talk. So I will try to take my time and add some more. But I did prepare a briefer overview, but hopefully that saves a little more time for some back and forth and some collaboration. So I will share screen. Oh, I don't have rights to share screen. I'm not sure if you can give me a right.
Yeah, give me 1 second. There you go. You should be all set.
Sweet. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's see. All right. Hopefully everyone can see what I'm sharing. Yes. Just a thumbs up from somebody. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Again, it's such a pleasure and privilege to be here with you all. I have the honor today of sharing a bit about an initiative that is really near and dear to my heart. Again, in the hopes of generating some dialogue, some ideation, some creative collaboration around expanding more community-led and community-oriented initiatives that are deliberate to tending to the wounds that many in our community carry, and in particular the women of our communities. And again, I think what Sara had shared, I think articulates a lot of that so beautifully as we think about bringing that into practice. So again, my name is Jaylan. I am currently a PhD student in counseling psychology. And I come from a youth work and education background. And my share today is really a reflection and like an intersection of those two worlds, if you will. I'm here on behalf of a wonderful organization by the name of Malika, which is a collective of women of color trainers, organizers, and facilitators that gather around the pursuit of power building for both individuals and communities. With the understanding that gender-based violence and patriarchy, white supremacy, and all the interlocking systems of oppression globally that create norms that often leave women, in particular Black, Indigenous, migrant, low-income, visibly Muslim, disabled, and other women of color in unsafe realities, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And that organization runs a number of really phenomenal programs. And I am here to just discuss one of the newest initiatives coming up on our year mark in just a week or two, alhamdulillah. All right, so within the framework and spirit of Malika's mission, we created formally the Spirituality Series Study Group last Ramadan. There have been iterations like one-offs before this point, but we have formally created the series just a year ago. And this is a space that we created really dedicated to advancing the goals of deepening understanding of life stories of female historical figures in Muslim community history. So that would include women within our faith tradition and within the global ummah throughout time. We reflect on the divine wisdom that frames their lives. Why has God shared their story in this way or created the circumstances he did for them? What can we learn from this, right? We seek to find ways to derive strength from their example of survival, their influence, their example of human hope, right? Their modeling. And finally, we develop strategies to revive and honor their legacies within community consciousness through both individual and collective action. And we gather in the form of a drop-in friendly, gender-inclusive, virtual psychosocial support group model. So it's not a class. It has a very specific sort of structure that we gather around. And we embed our strategy in the spirit of healing justice, which I will get to in just a moment. So I wanted to just share a little poll that we did early on in our time together. So on the surface, this might seem purely an educational initiative, but the inspiration around it is really multi-pronged. And this poll was shared, just a snippet of some members have shared about the importance of learning about Muslim women of the past. So if you see here, some of the poll results we gathered reflect a variety of responses. But the most commonly responded to in this survey, demonstrated just by its size, which reflects the frequency of those responses within this platform, is the idea of equality, which is a loaded term, right? It may look and mean different things for different people, but it's certainly become apparent from our conversations, from the narratives of many a woman, that the baseline in many of our community spaces feels like something other than equality, including in the very nature of a religious education. In another poll that we did in this same session, we had only about 11% of participants share that women figures were included in part of their religious education or exposure growing up. The rest of that 89% of people cited at times to not at all on the poll. So obviously this is a self-selected group, a random poll. It maybe doesn't reflect perfectly the experiences of all people in all Muslim communities, but for these people and many of the people who joined our group over time, it's become clear that it has been hard for people to name women in our tradition, right? To remember them, to relate to them, even at the baseline, what it means to relate to these people, not as like distant storybook characters, but as people in their full personhood and with their full agency. And that when they did learn about women in their religious spaces or through their religious education, it was often that we were spoken as like supporting cast, right? Background actors, if you will, within our sacred histories. And that reality really created at times confusion for women in particular, but also to any person in our community around ideas and notions and norms of female belonging, spiritual identity, sources of strength in what often exists as already hostile and unwelcoming environments for Muslim women, and not all, but too many community spaces. So a quick breakdown to be a bit more specific about the framing. We hold closely that the principles of healing and transformative justice in our framework, meaning in really simple terms, and we can go more into depth about it if people are curious. But in simple terms, we see healing as part and parcel of acting for social change, and social change as part and parcel of healing. We think about transformation as leveraging the creative power that is able to connect our past, our present, and a reimagined future. So each session we have a deliberate time for community building and connection. We believe that is central to be able to have these conversations in a way that feels safe, that really reflects the spirit of why we are doing what we are doing. We then have co-created some rules of engagement that center anti-oppressive practice and personal agency in the process of being in the group. And then, we transition into a spotlight overview, right? This is typically done through a couple of different ways. We usually, not always, but we usually send out some resources to read or to watch or to listen to about these figures in advance of a session. And then a particular facilitator will do a presentation on that figure to level that reference point for discussion in the case that people cannot engage with those resources beforehand. This facilitator is not a scholar, and it rotates, right? And that is done in the spirit of co-led, co-teaching, co-learning models that are rooted in principles of popular education. And it helps create a safer space for many who may have experienced harm in highly hierarchical spaces, where there are very rigid standards about who had authority on knowledge and who could not, right? There's a clear guideline in place for how to cite resources and be thoughtful about fair representation of different schools of thought, which doesn't come up too often because, we're talking about retelling life stories and not so much matters that deal with interpretation, but nonetheless, we really are mindful about our limitations. And we hold that much of our lived experiences and knowledge base is valuable to ourselves and others. And this spotlight overview, the facilitator will pose some questions, and the questions are meant largely to be framed in the spirit of liberation psychology. So we do root our efforts in building of critical consciousness and relevance of history. We are unpacking the forces and impacts of patriarchy throughout time, classism throughout time, racism throughout time, ableism, ageism, all considerations about forces of power in the spotlight figure's life and our own. We seek guidance from the prophetic model of teaching that rewards vulnerability, is radically inclusive and strengths-based, seeing the holy and good potential in all, no matter how they come, right? We're also inspired by its ability to be deliberate in connecting one's growth in awareness of world affairs and lived experiences to the internal experiences of our inner worlds, our spiritual health, right? The concept of basira is sort of at the center of our pursuits, right? A deepening of spiritual insight and centering is part of how we think about holistic wellness for this life and the next. And in that way, we open up honest and raw dialogue, right? Process experiences and attitudes towards grief, towards abuse, towards fear of the unknown, questions and disconnection and connection to God, and why that sometimes feels hard for people to access, and sifting through that in an honest and vulnerable way. And ultimately, we just are opening up space for people to determine how they connect, how they want to learn, how they see themselves or others differently, see their faith differently when engaging in the world of and life of these women. How do they consider change in their own life, or the type of change they want to bring to communities or societies they exist in, whether that's by holding a personal story as a reminder for their own struggle, elevating these stories more into their circles. So these women are, elevated more in the collective consciousness of the community, which in and of itself, right, can usher forward change. Or more brazen and bold moves towards social change in and outside of Muslim spaces, and we dialogue. So over the course of the last year, we have covered 17 women, our 18th coming up this Sunday, have a growing list of over 80 women we are hoping to continue to cover, have members that represent over 6 countries, have people who have joined and been consistently engaged from various faith traditions, particularly during our Women of the Quran series. We have an intergenerational space where ages range from teens to older adulthood. And we've been able to develop a pretty consistent virtual community during a time of pretty increased isolation and disconnection, which I know has meant a lot to people. Just the other day, one of our members who's based in London was talking about how she received a care package from one of our other members in San Francisco, and they have never met, right? But have been able to develop this connection across space within the global ummah. And these factors combined have contributed to a really dynamic and globally focused and meaningful space for people to find affirmation in vulnerability, affirmation in ancestry, and sacred history, affirmation in and from God, and affirmation in their experiences, emotions that build deeper self-awareness about their own sense of self and wellness, and pursuits towards building a world that feels like it's one they deserve, right? One that reflects more accurately the prophetic tradition, one that is constant in breaking down barriers that make accessing spiritual health and growth so difficult for some, one filled with peaceful relationships, rich with integrity, with freedom, with justice, with equity, and human dignity for every individual who belongs to it. So we do have a session feedback form, and I just want to share one of the comments that was left as an informal sort of testament to the power of spaces like these, and perhaps a call to seek a way to build more groups dedicated to spiritually rooted healing in this way that is not only mindful of identity, but the realities of marginalization and structures of power throughout time. And seeing that as a platform for both seeking spiritual liberation and liberatory action. So quote, "This series has been both empowering and healing for me. I wish there were resources like this when I was in my 20s. Although I had been taught about some of these wonderful women growing up, I never received the knowledge from an empowered perspective. It was more as these women were blessed, but also long-suffering women and our wives. However, through this group, I have learned that these monumental women were indeed strong, encouraging leaders, businesswomen, and at times breadwinners who thought out of the box when the majority did not. May Allah be pleased with all of them. I tell you, I have been so inspired and look forward to sharing the knowledge that I have gained with other Muslim females, especially youth. It is important that Muslim girls are sprinkled with these positive seeds in order that they walk with their heads high and are truly comfortable and empowered as they move in and out of different spaces as Muslim females." I believe I will stop there, though I could go on, and I'm excited to sort of dialogue maybe about more specifics or like visions about how this could be improved or expanded. But I just want to thank again my co-panelists. May God bless your efforts and those who are doing great work in the community here. Forgive me for any shortcomings, please. And yeah, very happy to connect further. I'll just flash that for a moment, and then I'll stop the share so I can see everybody, inshallah.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those presentations. That was a lovely introduction to kind of set the stage for what this conference really is and the reasoning behind it and the energy that comes into it. So I'd love to open up the floor. I didn't get any direct messages for questions. I'd love to open up the floor if the speakers want to comment on each other's work, or if anybody has anything they'd like to say. We've got about 20 minutes, 25 minutes to converse. So one thing I really found interesting and really liked was how in the first presentation, the analogy, the elephant analogy, right? I found it very relevant to even what like the Muslim Mental Health Conference is, to take that time to really zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And I wrote down this quote that you said, patriarchy and misogyny is inherently European. And I felt like that really went well and hand in hand with Jaylan, your presentation and the idea behind that. Do you guys want to talk a little bit, touch a little bit more on that and your thoughts on that?
I really appreciate being here with you and Jaylan, your presentation was fantastic. I love hearing about the work you're doing. And I really do think our presentations completely go together. You know, the idea of recovering historical memory is one of the, I think is central to the work you're doing in the psychosocial support group, and so important. And loved hearing what you had to say, and think it's an amazing model. And you know, the idea of getting women together and talking about our roots and our foremothers is so powerful. And it is, again, it's a psychological work, that critical consciousness raising. I love that you said that, like the critical consciousness raising. That's an immense um, uh, area of work for psychology, in my opinion.
I appreciate your words. And I also appreciate sort of just the notion of historical amnesia, the ways that you sort of explored that in the ways that you did. I think just through the process of being in this group with, talking about the things that we're talking about, if it's very clear that people feel cheated, right? That they did not learn about some of these people, right? That's a very prevalent feeling, that there is anger, actually. And that's a prevalent emotion sometimes in our conversations, that we're not able to sort of access, or given access in our religious or educational spaces to these incredible people and understand them as they were, right? And a quick illustration of this, and I had meant to sort of share this in my presentation, and it slipped my mind. Just like, thinking about one of our recent sessions, I will share. Some months ago, we were unpacking the reality of Ayman, who, is the reality is that not many people knew or taught about her. And she was among one of the most cherished and beloved mother figures of the Prophet. And this is a Black woman, right, who is held at the status of mother for our Prophet, a status that is exceptionally special and sacred and demands respect, right? How then can we connect that truth from our tradition to the realities we witness in this moment, and for generations and generations of disrespect of Black women and rampant anti-Blackness that exists within our faith communities, right? That actively harms many of our siblings in faith. So, learning about the spirit and the struggle of Ayman is healing for all, regardless of identity, to see this person who is relatable, who is celebrated, who's influential, who, introduces some real complexity around spiritual identity. It's a process that feeds spiritual health and development. And then when we open up space for dialogue around connection, and not knowing this part of our history, it's painful, right? It's painful for our Black sisters in particular. And this leads to a place where we discuss, right? We story share, we generate conversations about power and how power flows in our society and our communities. And, to your point, right? Sometimes the erasure of some of these truths, right, and the process of restoring these memories, right, is so critical to wellness, right? So critical to sort of be finding ways to resist and transform some of these toxic sort of patterns that we have learned over time, that we've taught through maybe colonial structures. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've got another question here, and this is for you, Sarah. Does framing the centrality of conflict to human society as a mental illness risk pathologizing structural power differentials and systems of oppression that are at the root of historical amnesia and psychic harm that you discussed?
I have to say, I don't totally understand the question, Bismillah. I don't totally understand the question, because I think structural power differentials and systems of oppression are pathological. I mean, I think for me, in my view of it, the way we structure power in our society is incredibly pathological. And I think, even just the idea that 11% of the women who came to your groups had that 90% of the women who came to your groups hadn't even heard about the centrality of women, that wasn't part of their Islamic education or their education. I mean, that is pathological. That half of our society, that we women are 50% of the society, and you know, that we're getting, you know, tiny amounts of uh, of 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 focus. And I think it's incredibly pathological, and I think this collective psychic harm, as you say, this is collective psychic harm. Um, is again, you know, this idea of the dialectic. There's a constant. The harm happens individually, and then the harm happens societally, and I mean, the example of Ayman, I hope I'm saying it right. Ayman is a perfect example. You know, we have this societal anti-blackness and the societal racism, the structural racism that we're seeing that's so deeply harming all of us. And then it comes back into the intense trauma that we're experiencing individually. And how do we interrupt that cycle? I think is a critical question. Where does the anti-racist work, particularly anti-racist or anti-patriarchal, or where do we talk? How do we talk about these? What you're saying, structural power differentials? How do we talk about those in ways that really unravel kind of this cyclical harming that's going on? I think this idea of historical memory, and I think Jaylan's work is really uh, you know, is really where the rubber meets the road on this work of conscientization. You know, how does this happen? So yeah, Jaylan, I would love to hear your thoughts on framing the centrality of conflict in human society, and structural oppression, and what you think about that in terms of the dialectic between you know, macro level harms versus individual harms. I'd love to hear about how you see that.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for your words. I think we see them as unentangled, right? Unable to be separated, right? Like individual health cannot be understood without understanding the context that we exist in, right? Not only in the present, but like the historical elements of it. And that's why we're sort of thinking about this in an intentionally ahistorical way, right? And yes, I think that's sort of what we invite and we center in our dialogues, right? A lot of our micro level experiences of pain and grief and trauma are part and parcel of our existence within systems that are not designed for our benefit and our wellness, right? And it's not new, right? These structures, and I think that is part of sort of looking at these stories of these women about how they also navigated systems of oppression, right? How do we see ourselves as able to connect to them? How do we see mirrors in them, right? And in one another, right? And how is that process in and of itself healing? That we're doing that community building across time, right? It's not just with the people on the Zoom room, it's with people who lived thousands of years ago too. They're part of our community, they're within our hearts, right? And we hold them that way as we collectively think about navigating a really harmful society, right? And we think about that through a spiritual lens, right? Maybe what is the purpose of that? Why has God created it this way? And we engage in those types of reflections as well. But 100%, I think it's a disservice to not consider just the socio-political pieces of wellness. Right?
I have a question actually. Can you guys hear me? Okay. You mentioned that these structures that are not of benefit to us are old and have been kind of ingrained in our system for a long time. So like as students, what do you think that we can do to try attempting at changing them slowly? And if so, if you think we can, if so, how do you think we can? Where should we start?
I can, a part of what we do is reflect on that pretty intentionally, but what does action look like? And that's a pretty central ethos that we hold just from like our faith, right? That like knowledge is powerful, but knowledge also should be translated into action, right? So what are some actionable steps that we can take to resist and transform and care for ourselves and others? So I'm happy to share maybe like some of the things that have come up from our group, right? And I don't have all the answers as an individual, and sometimes this is an iterative process, and we try to generate ideas together and collaboratively over time. But I, just reflecting on, in the last year, what people have often shared just as commitments or things that they really want to move forward with, or like sometimes just personal practices in their own lives, right? Giving themselves grace around really highly stigmatized issues, right? When we look back at sort of the legacies of many women and the successes of many women and the ways they might have been stigmatized in society, but like triumphed, right? Like stigmas around fertility or divorce, or thinking about family in more expansive ways. When we reflect on sort of just the community support model, the age of the prophet, especially for folks who might not experience safety within their immediate family structure. There is sort of the concept that a lot of people sort of take forward around like elevating these stories, being loud about these women's example, to reject the idea that women were not part of our history or are able to be made invisible, right? That might seem micro, but it is very radical. Or being more serious about sort of change, being serious about like more radical change or large scale change, right? That might reflect a different norm than that which exists, right? We often find ourselves in places where we open up questions about intra-community tension as part of this. So there is the concept of like, who are we as Muslims, and how do we interact with the world around us as people, but how do we also interact with ourselves within community? And what then does accountability look like, right, with yourselves and our relationships, right? We actually ended up doing a special session on restorative justice in Islam after one of our sessions, born out of one of our discussions, because we really wanted to explore that a little bit more and think about what small and big actions we could be taking just on the interpersonal, right? And see that as radical, right? Small revolutionary moments that accumulate to bigger change. So those are some of the things that come to mind when I think about some of the things that we've come up with. There have been like whisperings of like maybe more intentional organizing efforts that we could collaborate around in perhaps the future. But and there are many members who do that on their own time as well, but to be seen, right? To be determined when, inshallah.
We got another question in that I think ties really well with kind of where the conversation is going. What does utilizing a liberation psychology framework look like within individual psychotherapy sessions while working with the marginalized population?
So is it okay, Jaylan, if I take this one? So I work with homeless youth in my day-to-day practice as a case manager in San Francisco, and a lot of them are queer, young queer youth, and a lot of them do things like sex work and IV drug use, and they're living in a lot of really extreme situations a lot of the time. And I had a client come to me, and he was talking about his sex work, and I could tell he was people have a variety of opinions on sex work and what people think about sex work and what role that plays in society and what that means. And I could tell that he was kind of going, he'd been doing sex work since he was young. I could tell he was thinking, what is this woman? Who is this woman, and why is she here, and what is she going to think about me? And I could tell there was a certain amount of like, is this a shameful thing? Like, is this a deal killer for me and my esteem in society? And this ties back into Jaylan's work. I said, sex work is one of the oldest professions in the world, I said to him. And I don't know if you know this, but one of the most famous Sufi saints was a prostitute until she was 50. Rabia of Basra was a prostitute until she was in her 50s. She did sex work for the majority of her life. And I said, and additionally, Jesus, peace be upon him, has four mothers mentioned in the Bible, one of whom, Rahab, was a prostitute and was a sex worker. And I could see something lit up in his mind when he heard me, clearly a woman who was very religious, talk to him about the fact that highly esteemed women in my scriptural tradition and my religious tradition were sex workers. And I have a really good rapport with this client, and he's wanted to do school, and COVID kind of derailed him, and he's wanted to do work, and I have this great working relationship with this client, and those examples, this example of Rahab, Jesus' grandmother, and Rabia Basra are examples that I bring up in my work with my clients. And in that sense, it's an action of recovering historical memory. And I think in terms of individual casework with clients, that's one concrete example of how raising consciousness about our tradition changes. Again, is this shameful? Is this shameful? Well, the elephant is there's a lot of women who are really famous and really high esteemed who have been sex workers. And, and raising that consciousness is, I think, a critical piece of being in the field of social work, of mental health, of psychology. And I think for us as social workers, we have an obligation to pursue knowledge, and we have obligation as Muslims to pursue knowledge, but we have obligation as social workers, as psychologists, as working in psychology, to pursue this kind of knowledge and uncover the history. What is our history? What is the truth of history? And this reflection that we do individually, moving back to our interactions with clients, moving back to individual reflection. I think we have an obligation to seek that knowledge and share it with society. We have incredible privilege with what we have educationally. There's so many people who are just gasping for an education in this world. And the fact that we have kind of the privilege to sit in the conference and talk about this stuff, incredibly privileged situation that we're in, and that we have an obligation to really work hard to reflect and share that knowledge. And that's just one example, I don't know, for what it's worth.
Jaylan, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
You did such a beautiful job, Sarah. I think, I think our tradition is healing, and I think being unafraid to sort of really name, again, the ways that I think there's like a piece around like locating the problem, right? As opposed to inside a person to outside of a person, right? Which is intuitive, but it's not always how people practice, right? I think really being mindful of like when you're sitting in front of someone to raise consciousness around maybe the ways that they're reacting to really unhealthy conditions is normal, right? And really bring some consciousness to that. And then again, like using the tradition, using history, using like points of like references of resistance as part of the healing process, right? It can be really powerful. Boston Liberation Health have a really beautiful framework for people to check out if they're interested in thinking more about that.
Yeah, as you guys are speaking, I reflected on, you had mentioned, Jaylan, that, asking this question of like, why has God done this, right? And sorry, it kind of reminded me of something you had said in your presentation when you said, I contemplated for so long, how can Jesus be the Son of God, right? And then after you kind of went through that realization, you were able to, it freed up so much more space in your mind. And I think that freeing of space is really where that growth and development can take place. And we can have conversations such as like liberation psychology and what does that actually mean in practice, right?
I also wanted to say, like, I think that's so important for us as Muslim women, because like the aspect of liberation psychology, because once you realize, like you mentioned, that a lot of these like misogynistic practices don't even come from our own religion, you kind of have that like freedom in your mind, like this, because I think it causes like confusion as you grow up, because you're like, okay, if I'm practicing this faith, why is it so against me? And then when you realize that it's not actually against you, it also gives you this freedom too.
Yeah, Noor, that's such a great point. And I feel like that's very indicative of like so many Muslim women who get pushed away from the religion because there is this misogynistic framework in place that really isn't even true to Islam.
You know, it reminds me, again, I so appreciate, and I want to say this before we close, that I so appreciate being with all of you in this learning space. It's just such an honor and a privilege to be talking with all of you about these topics. I think, yeah, you know, the idea that that what you're saying, Noor, that when you own your space, your experience of the religion changes. And you know, I think recovering our history, understanding who we are as Muslim women, is deeply connected to understanding who the women were in the life of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who the women are in the Muslim tradition, and owning that space. You know, if you look, I mean, even if you look, there's kind of like a psychic body language. I don't know, it's just vivid image comes to mind of, you know, a woman who's kind of like cowering, you know, slumped, not able to stand up, you know, burdened, you know, shrunk down, you know, eyes downcast, you know, because of the weight of everything coming in. I feel like, you know, that's a horrible place that doesn't feel good. That feels bad, and it's not healthy. And if we recover our power and our strength and our tradition, we understand we can own our space. We can look right in the eye of anyone who comes at us. We understand how important our foremothers are and how important women are in this tradition. And we understand, you know, the way we operate as a community now with all of the strong women voices. It's not an anomaly. We didn't suddenly come out of, you know, out of nowhere. If anything, the only reason it looks different is a result of colonialism, is a result of the destruction of Muslim culture. That the destruction of our tradition is a result of colonialism, and the destruction of our world as a result of colonialism is what is creating the shrinkage in our psychic space. And that to push back on that and to set some boundaries around that collectively as a religion, as women in this religion, is critical, and is going to open up our ability to see the world and operate in the world in ways that are healthy and functional in new ways. And I think it will. It is a process of revitalizing our faith that's critical, and in the process, our spiritual well-being and our overall well-being.
Such powerful words. I couldn't agree more. I think that process of just historical reclamation, recovery, re-engagement, right, allows people to see there might be a different way, right? There's a different way forward, which can be so profound, with respect to the world that we are living in, and what spiritual like health looks like, right? That sense of hope. Something that, you know, I'll just name as well, as I have been doing like reflection on just the last year, and maybe what we want to consider moving forward, is often issues around like anything that has women in it is very much relegated to like women's spaces, right? Which can also be a problem, right? Because I do think that there is impacts of these structures of oppression on the psyches of people of all genders, right? So we're intentionally a gender inclusive space for this reason, but people who are not female have not showed up. And that could be shortcomings on our part, right? Or it can be a reflection of maybe something else, right? Around where people feel like they want to be and self-select into. And, there's some pros also with it being that like a lot of people who do show up do have a particular sort of experience or share a certain type of social identity. It does create a little, for a lot of people who've experienced trauma, especially, can create some safety. But these histories are important for everyone to learn, right? And everyone to reclaim and everyone to restore, and can have healing power for all as well. So like, how can we think about also elevating that in different spaces that we exist, or expanding some of these initiatives to really move that work forward? So that's just some 2 cents around that as well.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe one more question. If anybody wants to write it in the chat box or just hop on, I'll give it a few minutes. Otherwise, oh, here we go. Oh, this was you, sorry. Yeah, we got a few more minutes for one more question.
I have a question for Jaylan. How did you come up with your list of women?
We co-created it, with the group. So we have a database, and people add as like things come to mind. So last Ramadan we had a pilot series where I just personally picked some women that I have felt like spiritually connected to over time, and then over the summer we did a Woman of the Quran series. And then we have transitioned into like women in the tradition. So we started with the mothers, we're now on the partners, and we will continue. But we have a very lengthy list of people who are not necessarily part of the sacred tradition, but are just incredible people, like that have done incredible work and have incredible sort of legacies around the world throughout time, which are also part of the erasure, right? And when we think about sort of cultural heritage as well. So yeah, there's a journey ahead, inshallah, that we're all excited about.
I have another question for you, Jaylan, as well. How is membership controlled? Can people just join your group? Is it open to anyone joining at any time? How does that work?
Yeah, that's been like a little bit of a growing edge for us. So we contemplated, if drop-in versus like controlled membership would be advantageous, and we actually ended up deciding drop-in. So it is a drop-in friendly group. So that means that people do need to register through like a particular form, but everyone is welcome. We do have a pretty solid group of members that are pretty consistent at this point and come through, which has made it a really special community. But there are always, new folks or people who will take a break and come back, which also makes it quite dynamic. But it also sort of helps us, requires of us to be really thoughtful about how to establish safety, right, within the space, especially with the nature of the topics that we're talking about. So a number of the people who do facilitate or have created the framework are mental health professionals or mental health professionals in training, and we try to sort of use that knowledge to create some facilitation norms and like space norms around how to really navigate that. But it is tricky, right? We haven't, that comes with some challenges and some pros for sure. But yeah, as of now, it is drop-in friendly. And yes, I could absolutely send the link for registering. Is it okay if I send it to somebody after and they send it out, or would it be helpful now? I can try
send it to me and I'll send it out.
Perfect. Will do, inshallah.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. One last chance for another question. Otherwise, I will end this meeting and we'll see you in the next room. Thank you so much to the presenters. That was lovely.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Take care, everybody.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.